Yo, what's up? It's Renon, and I'm going to talk about the class updates on the PTR in Korea, so let's jump right into it. The main thing you'll see at the start is that the synergy buffs have been rethought for a lot of different classes. A good example is the Reaper, who now lowers the enemy's defense rather than a crit damage buff for her and her party to overall increase the Reaper's party synergy. If only we had Reaper Smilegate, which we don't. Anyways, they added more counter skills for each class and made it so that some back attacks can also have counters tied to them, and from what I understand, this doesn't mean that you can counter from behind. It just means that attacks that are effective from behind can also be used to counter the boss if the boss just so happens to look at you. There's also structure and class balance, which I think is very apparent for a class like Soulfist. Instead of the class having literally 4-ish buff abilities, they instead removed the buffs and just added a baseline 30% damage increase, making it so the raw damage output of the class is higher without relying on the annoying buff playstyle to do damage. Back attacks are also coming into effect more. Smilegate did say that they were going to think about designing fights around back attack classes a bit more because it can be a pain in the ass to make work. So with this in mind, it seems like Smilegate is changing a lot of skills to be more back attack oriented. But let's get into the class changes because that's what you guys are slobbering all over your keyboard waiting for. Overall, there are PvP changes which reduce the effectiveness of damage reduction in PvP specifically. For classes, we have Berserker, which has some attacks changed to a back attack to make them more effective. Assault Blade has been turned into a party buff, and Mountain Crash has turned into another Chainsword little brother-esque ability. The spell Counters gives attack speed and now increases party damage by 6% for 10 seconds. Swordstorm and Hellblade got their damage nerfed for Mayhem by 30% at max rank, and Red Dust is also a smaller party buff with a lower cooldown now. Mayhem also got up to a 4% damage nerf overall with the engraving, and also no more full healing with green potion boys. You'll have to use big potions like the rest of us. For Gunlancer, the red class engraving is getting some love in terms of more damage to compensate for the blue engraving just straight outclassing it. The blue Lancer, from what I understand, is the tankier version and fares quite well to fit with the utility role in parties while also doing a lot of good damage. The red Lancer is a more damage oriented spec but was not really doing enough damage, so Smilegate wanted to buff their output a bit. You can see the damage changes for different red Lancer abilities here. Some abilities got a massive damage increase from Tripod, so maybe you can be the Giga Chad red Lancer you've always wanted to be. Destroyer is a class that was, for one, kind of underperforming, but also had positioning requirements for a lot of the abilities for a class that is really clunky. It's the class that was meant to be even more absurd than Berserker with an even bigger weapon and even slower attacks. As such, some of the requirements for tripods were absurd considering how fast bosses move, so they changed the Luck Core tripod, which required hitting your hammer on the first or final attack to just apply a defense reduction regardless of what part of the attack lands. In essence, you just have to hit your ability and you get the debuff effect. The class now revolves even more around its identity gauge of having 1 to 3 gravity cores to work with its new tripod change, which is overall going to make Destroyer a bit easier to make work. Paladin got some massive changes. Wait, no it didn't. They just changed some attacks to back attacks. This seems to be a part of their structural change to a lot of classes, and because Paladin doesn't really want to be in front of the boss pretty much ever, it makes sense to make some of their attacks back attacks instead. Wardancer seems to have changed. Similar to Soulfist, they took away the buff of Whisper of Wind for the Wardancer and instead made it a mana recovery and supplemented the damage nerf by increasing the normal skill damage by a whopping 18% and the awakening damage by 14%. There's also some back attack changes, which of course seems to be what Smilegate is going for, and a buff to the underperforming engraving by up to 5% at max rank. I'm not sure if this is a buff or a nerf overall, but it seems that they increased the DPS and lowered the burst overall. Scrapper similarly had the attack power buffs from different skills completely removed, and instead Smilegate increased the overall damage of Scrapper by 24% along with some attack changes. Reliance on buffs made a gap between the good and bad Scrappers become too wide and also made the playstyle rigid apparently from the dev log that they wrote about it. Instead, Smilegate wanted Scrapper to be an all-around Hulk smashing fun class, so they made the raw damage higher and nerfed the buff reliance of the class. The weaker engraving also got an up to 5% damage buff at max rank. And following that, Soulfist is following the exact same trend. I mean, you can probably see a pattern in what they meant by the structural changes to all the classes. Basically remove buffs and make the classes a little bit more streamlined, in my opinion, is basically what they're going for, and Soulfist is really no different. The skill damage of Soulfist outside of the Awakening is receiving a 30% buff, which is really huge, but the buffs that used to give more than 55% attack power is getting removed, which is going to be sad times. From what I can tell, in an optimized damage scenario, this is a nerf to Soulfist. However, I think in practicality, it's going to be a buff. When a class relies on buffs, like pretty much every class in the game, if the boss ever moves out of the way or CCs you or anything, your damage will plummet, and it makes using one ability in between boss attacks very ineffective because abilities don't do a lot of damage on their own without the buff. But now with the 30% more damage, weaving attacks in between the boss patterns will obviously be 30% more effective, and thus won't be as punishing when you don't have your buff windows up. And based on the hellscape design of bosses in Lost Ark that move, crowd control, and just decide to run at the worst of times, I can see this being a nice quality of life and damage buff in actual boss encounters. This may also mean that different builds are more viable since you don't have to revolve around the damage abilities anymore and can now replace them with more raw damage skills that will now deal 30% more damage. Outside of that, the second Awakening skill got a 55% damage buff and some skill changes that I'll scroll through if you want to look at them. Lancemaster, which we haven't received yet, has gotten some nice back attack changes, which equates to more damage on some skills and some crit rate nerfs on a few skills as well. There's additions of crit damage and overall skill damage buffs to compensate. Red Dragon Gun also now doesn't have a tip of the spear mechanic, and instead just landing the skill makes it do max damage. So with the back attack changes and overall damage buffs, I think that Glavier will be a bit more reliable and do some bigger burst, with slightly less crit, which you may have to compensate for. Keen Blunt Weapon won't be quite as effective as well because you lose like 20% crit rate on some of the buffs that you had. But that just means that the peaks will be a little bit lower, but the troughs and the damage will be a little bit higher. Striker My Baby got some back attack changes, which are pretty meh, but thank God Lightning Tiger Strike has changed. By the way, can we appreciate this translation? Somehow Lightning Tiger Strike was translated to Wee Thunderbolt from Korean, apparently from what Google Translate is telling me. I don't know what happened here, but apparently the bread and butter skill Wee Thunderbolt no longer allows strikers to go through the boss. The amount of times you either die to a mechanic or lose damage repositioning to behind the boss after using the hardest hitting skill is too damn high. Now, Striker may actually receive a bit higher DPS now that we don't have to involuntarily reposition and lose around 30% damage and 10% crit rate buff from back attacks during our buff window by Lightning Tiger Strike or Wee Thunderbolt shooting us through the boss. Deadeye had head attack removal from execution, and the handgun engraving has up to a 10% damage buff to handgun abilities. Not a lot of changes, but that handgun damage might be really nutty. I don't play this class, but some people aren't satisfied that there weren't more buffs, but I've heard that the actual DPS output of the class is really high on its own, it's just really hard to play. Artellerists got their back attacks removed and instead got a flat 5% damage boost to compensate. I'll scroll through the changes here. To be honest, I don't understand the damn class, but it seems that they wanted to remove the clunkiness of one of the slowest classes to not have to rotate behind the boss a lot. Also, the Turret Awakening skill has 30% more HP, so that is really nice. Mainly, it seems that Artellerist got some quality of life changes which might increase the damage overall. It's just like Striker, sometimes not inconveniencing the player by making unnecessary movement requirements for skills will have a proper damage rotation be a little bit easier without disruption. This could easily increase damage by a ton just by the sheer fact that you can actually get your rotation off properly and do max damage. Hawkeye got some head attack removals, minor ability changes to gauge building, and a nice buff to the second companion class engraving to give up to 10% attack power, which seems really nutty. They removed the hot gauge recovery from the engraving, but they gave the overall class a 50% natural recovery in PvE, which is quite literally a buff as well as a baseline change. Because Hawkeye tends to run both class engravings at level 3, there's going to be a close to 10% damage buff overall for Hawkeyes. This is definitely going to make Hawkeye more competitive, I bet. Some people may even find it more enjoyable. Scouter got some head attack removal, turn to back attacks, and some quality of life changes on attacks that give raw attack power without a damage type requirement. Also, some abilities were buffed for PvE, with some counterattacks added to Avalanche and removed from Exilium Beam. Again, Google translated, I don't know what the actual ability names are. We don't even have this class, so I'm going to keep this short. I'll scroll through the changes so you can take a look if you want. Gunslinger only really changed in allowing the time to hunt engraving to shine a bit more by giving it up to a 5% crit rate buff. having Rain of Bullets be buffed dramatically as well. Rain of Bullets now does 23% more damage baseline, can back attack for up to 45% increased damage, or take another tripod that takes away the back attacks but increases your overall damage of the ability by 28% and gives 10% crit rate overall buff. Catastrophe also got a hefty buff as well, which might make it more desirable for damage for Peacekeeper Gunslingers. Summoners, a class that we probably won't get for 10 years, got an overall 5% damage buff on skills, but some skills got nerfed like Water Spirit. I don't play this class, I don't plan on playing this class, but it looks like Summoner is getting the Reaper treatment where some of their utility tied to their abilities are taken away, and now they get a better party synergy buff and a 12% enemy defense reduction. Overall, this will give them probably a bit more damage, as well as having better team synergy to make them more desirable for a group. Arcana, a class I've wanted to play as an OG Twisted Fate player from the early days of League of Legends. Fun fact, he was the first character I wanted to main like 10 years ago. Anyways, Arcana skills like Celestial Lane just got buffed on a lot of tripods across the board, with head attacks being removed as well. Basically, because of the RNG tied to the class and the bad average performance, Arcana got some pretty good buffs to a lot of skills and some additional bad luck reduction with, I guess, how the class identity gauge works. Bard got some nice buffs as well. Basically, the effect on some skill... Wait, zoom in on that. Does the translation say sex right there? I need to figure out what's going on with Google Translate. Anyways, the debuffs on enemies that bards could inflict now last 1 second longer across pretty much all skills, giving a longer damage window for her and her party. A nice utility buff for bards, and also a counter effect was added to a skill as well, so not bad, and now bards can MVP even harder. Sorcerers were basically the reincarnation of Merlin, destroying mobs like crazy and bosses as well. Outside of the counterattack added to frost columns and a back attack adjustment, the class's identity skill got nerfed. You can read them here, but basically they got a 2% and 4% reduction on their identity damage. It's still going to be a crazy class in my opinion. That and Mayhem Berserker were pretty overtuned, so I will see a lot of people still playing this class, and their damage will probably still be on the top end of everything. Deathblade just received a nerf to Surge Engraving. It's a bit confusing, but from what I understand is that Deathblades could stack up the Surge buff up to 20 times at 7.5% increased damage per stack, meaning that the buff from Surge could stack up to 150% increased damage, whereas now the buff can only reach 100% more damage max. So a potential 50% damage nerf, as well as the energy refunded being exponential, meaning getting full energy will be hard outside of getting the 20 stacks of Surge. Basically, the damage buff was nerfed at max stacks, and not getting the max stacks means that you won't refill your identity gauge like you could before. Shadowhunter has some changes to their dodge to be increased by an additional 1 meter, as well as an overall damage reduction to their abilities by close to 4%. But that may not be bad, because in the damage reduction's wake, Shadowhunter has received a party synergy buff on a lot of their skills to increase theirs and their party's damage by 6% for 10 seconds on their demon skills and then on their non-demon skills. Utility from Howl has been reduced to give the 6% damage buff, and also was reduced to give less gauge. But that's pretty much it for Shadowhunter. They basically got their playstyle a little bit changed to have a little bit more party synergy, and it should compensate for their overall damage reduction. Reaper, a class that I've wanted to personally play for a long time as a Zed main from League, and a huge rogue player from WoW, got some nice buffs as well. They got a 4.5% skill damage buff, as well as some abilities now give 12% defense reduction on enemies hit instead of a crit damage buff. Mathematically, from what the devs say, this debuff is stronger, so that's really good. Also, the clones that they can put out have more HP, so basically they got a raw damage buff and a synergy buff and a utility buff, basically buffed across the board. And that means I'm going to be really excited when we get Reaper in 5 years. Artist also got some changes, but I don't play the class and we won't receive it for a very long time, so I'll put the developer's notes here for you to look at if you want. Just be aware of the Google Translate. Anyways, that covers the class changes on the PTR, which might change in the future. A lot of classes got their rotations altered to be more forgiving, which I am all for, such as with Destroyer, Glaivier, and Soulfist. And we also got some nerfs to the big beefy boys of the game like Berserker and Sorcerer. It's pretty much what everybody expected, as doing 65% overall damage on my Berserker and Guardian raids was getting quite ridiculous, and that's before we even get to the true endgame. The raw damage of the class was pretty broken, so I'm glad that it got nerfed, and similarly for Sorcerer. But overall guys, that is going to be it for me today. Thank you so much for watching, and please stay tuned for more content in the future. But I'm out. Later guys.